Salacious History discusses sex, romance, and many other topics that are intended for a mature audience. Listener discretion is advised. Welcome to Salacious History, the podcast that explores moments in history that were shaped by sex, romance, and people who were generally down to clown. I'm your host, Sarah Duncan. In this episode, we continue our discussion on the 6 wives of Henry VIII. If you haven't listened to part 1 yet, go back and learn about Henry's early years as king and his marriages to Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. Today, we will be learning about wives 3 through 6, Jane Seymour, Anne of Cleves, Catherine Howard, and Catherine Parr. I have to admit that I knew almost nothing about these 4 women before I began my research for this episode. While there are countless resources, movies, and TV shows about Henry's first 2 wives, significantly less attention tends to be paid to the last 4, at least in my experience. But don't worry, there is still plenty of drama to go around in this episode. Alright, here we go. Henry VIII's 3rd wife was Jane Seymour. Jane's exact birth date is unknown. Various sources indicate that she was born anywhere from 1504 to 1509. She was the daughter of Sir John Seymour and Marjorie Wentworth, and was a descendant of King Edward III. They were a very wealthy family, with over 100 manors in 19 countries and 5 castles to their name. Jane wasn't well educated, as was often the case with women at this time. In fact, she only knew how to read and write her own name. But she was proficient in household tasks and various feminine hobbies, such as gardening and needlework. Jane was widely described as having a quiet, soothing manner. At different times, Jane served as a lady-in-waiting for both Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn. During her time serving Anne Boleyn, she witnessed firsthand the tumultuous relationship between Henry and Anne. It is likely that Henry knew of Jane, but there's no evidence to suggest that he took any notice of her until the fall of 1535, when he visited the Seymours' home. It is believed that Jane first caught Henry's eye during this visit. Some historians argue that this visit marked the beginning of King Henry's infatuation with Jane, but this isn't necessarily true. Anne Boleyn had not fallen completely out of favor with the king just yet. Anne was pregnant again, though tragically she would suffer a miscarriage the following January. Opposing historians posit that Jane was in the king's thoughts, but did not act on these thoughts for months. In February of the following year, rumors began to spread about the king being attracted to Jane. In stark contrast to Catherine and Anne, Jane was timid and reserved. This, in addition to her exceptional beauty and status, is thought to be what attracted Henry to her. Henry began to make his affections clear to Jane. He sent her expensive gifts, though she coyly returned them. He also promoted 2 of her brothers at court, increasing the Seymour family's social and political power. Her brother Edward and his wife moved into rooms that were connected to the king's apartment through a hidden passage. This hidden passage allowed Henry to further his courtship with Jane in relative privacy. Henry was acutely aware of the dangers of rumors and losing public favor after openly courting Anne Boleyn while he was still married to Catherine of Aragon. Consequently, he was much more discreet with Jane. From what we know of Jane's character, this subtle approach likely suited her just fine. Some sources indicate that she would never dine alone with the king, always insisting on having a chaperone present. At this point, Henry was already motivated to end his marriage to Anne Boleyn. The whole ordeal of his divorce and second marriage had been a complete disaster. His growing fondness of Jane Seymour merely gave him additional motivation for taking action. As we discussed in Part 1, following the death of Catherine of Aragon and Anne Boleyn's miscarriage of a son in January of 1536, Henry had a critical realization. If he could rid himself of Anne and marry Jane Seymour, he would have a legitimate marriage that was recognized by all, and he would once again have the possibility of siring a son. Jane and Henry were married on May 30th, 1536, just 11 days after Anne Boleyn was beheaded. Jane Seymour was publicly declared king on June 4th, 1536. The new queen chose the following motto on this occasion: bound to obey and serve. Again, she seemed to be putting as much distance as possible between herself and the headstrong Anne Boleyn. Unlike her predecessors, Jane never underwent a coronation. Thus, she was never officially crowned Queen of England. Minor plagues were sweeping through London at the time, and the king insisted that she wait until the following spring to be crowned. Some also speculate that Henry was waiting for Jane to deliver a son before holding the coronation, but this theory has never been proven. Almost a decade had gone by since the king's great matter first began, and yet Henry still did not have a legitimate heir. On July 20th, 1536, he received the crushing news that his illegitimate son, Henry Fitzroy, Duke of Richmond, had died at the age of 17. Until now, Henry could have fallen back on the possibility of Fitzroy succeeding him, but now Henry was left with only 2 illegitimate daughters to his name. The pressure was greater than ever. Jane Seymour must provide a son, or she would likely be discarded by her new husband. The political environment would not allow for any other option. But the king and queen did not have to worry for long. Rumors began circulating in early 1537 that the queen was with child. The rumors were finally confirmed in May of that year when there was a public announcement and rejoicing at the news of the queen's quickening, i.e., she could feel the baby kicking. It is said that bonfires were lit and celebrations were held throughout the country. Everyone was thrilled that a so-called true heir may finally be coming, and they prayed for a safe delivery. On October 12, 1537, Jane gave birth to a son. He was baptized and given the name Edward on October 15th. Henry's daughters and Edward's half-sisters, Mary and Elizabeth, attended the christening. After 29 long years as King of England, Henry VIII finally had the male heir he longed for. The joy of the occasion did not last long. Jane had endured a long and difficult labor, and it took a great toll on her body. She was able to attend and participate in her son's christening by being carried on a litter, but even this proved to be taxing for her. Just one day later, it was reported that the queen was very ill. She became delirious and spiked a high fever. Doctors bled her, a common treatment for fever at the time, but there was nothing that could be done. The young queen passed away near midnight on October 24th, 1537. She had only been Queen of England for a year and a half when she died. Modern historians believe that Jane died of puerperal fever, an infection that can occur after childbirth. There have been rumors that Jane died from complications of a cesarean section, the supposed result of Henry VIII ordering for the child to be ripped from her womb, but there's no evidence to support either of these claims. Jane Seymour was buried at Windsor Castle in St. George's Chapel. Henry took the death of his wife very hard. Not only had they been together for such a short time, but she was the mother of his son. Henry reportedly wore black for months after Jane's death and waited until 1540 to marry again. A lifetime for Henry. Of all of Henry's wives, Jane was the only spouse buried with him in the same tomb after his death. In her short time as Queen of England, Jane Seymour had produced a male heir, helped rebuild Henry's relationship with his estranged daughters, and had won back the favor of the English people after Henry's previous marriage tore the country apart. Her epitaph reads, "Here lies Jane, a phoenix, who died in giving another phoenix birth. Let her be mourned, for birds like these are rare indeed."